Everyone, I am Kim Kenney. I am the Executive Director at the McKinley Presidential Library and Museum, and I was scheduled to give you the full version of my program about women's suffrage before the pandemic hit. So I'm going to give you sort of the highlights of the story. It's so important in this centennial year that we make sure people understand how women got the right to vote and how all of these things unfolded to make that possible. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Get this started. Okay, so the women's movement really has its roots in abolition, and this seemed like a very appropriate cause for women to unite behind because it was appropriate for the sphere of women in domestic life and things like that. So in 1840, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whom you see here, they went all the way to London to attend the World Anti-Slavery Convention, and this was an all-male organization. And when they got there, and imagine what that trip was like in 1840. It's a big deal. You're crossing the ocean on a ship to get to this convention. And when they got there, they weren't allowed to participate because they were women. They were able to sit in the gallery and they could observe the proceedings, but they couldn't participate at all. So these women are not happy. And this prompts them to hold a women's convention in the United States when they got home. So the women's movement is formally set into motion in 1848 in this house. This is the Hunt House, which is located in the Finger Lakes region of New York State in a town called Waterloo. And Jane Hunt invited Lucretia Mott, Mary Ann McClintock, Martha Wright, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton to spend the day together on Sunday, July 9th, 1848, to discuss the possibility of planning a women's rights convention. And this is where the idea was born. The convention was held on July 19th and 20th, 1848, in the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls. So this is what it looked like when the museum was preserving the original wall. It's since been reconstructed a little bit. And 300 men and women attended. So the purpose was to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition of women. And the first day, women were the only ones who could participate. The second day, they let the men participate in the deliberations. So previously, women had believed that the right to petition was an appropriate way for them to enact reform. But as the abolition movement and the prohibition movements turned to political action in the 1840s, women soon realized that if they were going to be listened to, they had to have the elective franchise, meaning politicians don't care about you if you can't vote. So this became a kind of a transition for women to realize that petitioning is not enough. They have to be able to vote so that their voices would be heard. The women's rights paper, The Lily, said, "Why shall women be left only the poor resource of petition? For even petitions, when they are from women, without the elective franchise to give them backbone, are of but little consequence." So among the participants at that first convention was Frederick Douglass. So the women's movement is inextricably intertwined with abolition. And Abby Kelly, who was another abolitionist, wrote, "Women have good cause to be grateful to the slave, for in striving to strike his irons off, we found most surely that we were manacled ourselves." So the document that comes out of this convention is called the Declaration of Sentiments. And this is a water wall that has the entire text of it. And I'm not going to read all of it. I'll read just a part of it. But 68 women and 36 men signed it. And so when you think about how radical this idea is in 1848, and think about putting your name on it and really owning that this is something that you want to participate in, it's really extraordinary. So it was modeled after the format of the Declaration of Independence, which is essentially a list of our grievances against the British King. And so here are some of the things that it says. "The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. He has withheld from her rights which are given to the most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners. Having deprived her of this first right of a citizen, the elective franchise, thereby leaving her without representation in the halls of legislation, he has oppressed her on all sides. He has taken from her all right in property, even to the wages she earned. He has made her, if married, in the eye of the law, civilly dead. So if you go to Seneca Falls today and you visit the Women's Rights National Historic Park, this is what you'll see when you walk in the door. This exhibit is called The First Wave, and it's an exhibit of life-size bronze statues of some of the women who were at the first convention. And you can see second from the left, that is a statue of Frederick Douglass. So the McClintock House is the site where the Declaration of Sentiments were first drafted. This family was Quaker, and their home was a stop on the Underground Railroad. So this is also in Waterloo, where the Hunt House is. And then close by is the Elizabeth Cady Stanton House, which is also in Seneca Falls. So the Women's Rights National Historic Park includes the Wesleyan Chapel, where the convention was held, the Hunt House, the Stanton House, the McClintock House, and a modern museum building. So the second Women's Rights Convention was held not far from Canton in Salem, Ohio, 2 years later on April 9th, 1850. It was the first women's suffrage convention in the state of Ohio. So it began in the Hicksite Friends Meeting House, and this photograph is courtesy of the Salem Public Library. And it was organized by women exclusively. Men were not allowed to participate, but a few did attend. The women who couldn't attend sent letters to be read, and that included a letter from Lucretia Mott and also Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And this was timed specifically right before the Ohio Constitutional Convention that was scheduled for May 6th. So it was a little bit less than a month ahead of time. And the women at the convention passed a document with 22 resolutions, 3 which were directly related to suffrage, and the rest were about equal rights with men under the law. And they did this before the Constitutional Convention because they wanted their ideas to be considered, which of course they were voted down 73-7. So in 1852, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton joined forces to form the Women's New York Temperance Society. So prohibition and temperance is another related issue that women are very involved in the years leading up to the Civil War. Sojourner Truth joined women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton to petition the government to free the slaves, thinking that slaves and women would be granted the same rights as men at the same time. So incidentally, if you're familiar with the Ain't I a Woman speech, this is a speech that was given by Sojourner Truth at the Women's Rights Convention that was held in Akron. And right now they're raising money for a statue to her to commemorate that event. So this serves as an important training ground where women are learning lots of important skills. During the Civil War. So women are learning how to organize, they're involved in all kinds of war effort things, and all of the things that are happening prior to the war, temperance, abolition, women's rights conventions, all of that stops and the focus becomes on the war. So women are learning how to participate in organizing and all of that. So after the war, the American Equal Rights Association is founded by Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Martha Coffin Pelham Wright, and Ernestine Rose. And their goal is suffrage for all, regardless of sex. So in 1868, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed. And that last one gives voting rights to Black men. And women thought that their patriotism and their hard work during the war was going to be rewarded with the franchise to vote after the Civil War. They are bitterly disappointed when they are ignored. Freed Black enslaved men are allowed to vote and women are not. And in fact, before his death, Abraham Lincoln had declared that this hour belongs to the Negro. So it was seen that if you added women into it, it would be really too radical and it wouldn't have the support that it needed. So women are bitterly disappointed, and the Equal Rights Association splits into two separate and antagonistic camps. So on the one hand, you have the National Women's Suffrage Association with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And then on the other side, you have the American Women's Suffrage Association with Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe. So the first one we'll talk about, the National Women's Suffrage Association, is the more radical group. They are in favor of sweeping social change to ensure the status of women is improved, and they are in favor of a constitutional amendment for women to get the right to vote. They do not support the 15th Amendment because it doesn't include women. And so Frederick Douglass at this time splits from Stanton and Anthony, and they don't really ever recover from that. The very name of their periodical shows what these women are all about. It's called The Revolution. So they're very radical. The other group, the American Women's Suffrage Association, is a little bit less in your face about it. They favor the passage of women's suffrage through voting laws at the state level, not a federal constitutional amendment. And their periodical is called the Women's Journal. So it's much more polite. It has a literary tone and considered lots of topics within women's sphere. So both groups engage in the same sorts of activities, though. They're organizing, they are having educational campaigns throughout the country, they are delivering speeches, they are distributing thousands of leaflets and pamphlets, they are rallying support through presentations to women's clubs and temperance societies. But both of them are relentless and grueling campaigns, and they want the states, both of them are looking at state laws, but only the national group is looking at a federal law. So year after year after year, women are urging the passage of a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage. And in 1878, a women's suffrage amendment is introduced onto the floor of the U.S. Congress, but it was never sent for a vote. So in 1878, it first appears. So this goes on for several decades, these women working, separately, but for the same thing. And by 1890, these fierce rivalries and these animosities that previous generations had when they split start to fall apart, and they realize that they're stronger together than they are apart. So they found the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and this new group takes on the more moderate approach of the American group, but it still retains Stanton and Anthony as leaders, and they remain so till their deaths in 1902 and 1906. So in 1900, the torch is passed to a new generation, and Carrie Chapman Catt, who you see here, becomes the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and she created a grassroots effort that she called the Winning Plan to achieve suffrage at the state level. So here we have a map showing the dates of women's suffrage. So it's very different from state to state. So there were certain states where women could vote in the West. So Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, and Colorado. The West is always less traditional, and they're used to women working alongside men. If you think about as we expand westward and there's a pioneer frontier, that women are working hard in physical labor to clear the land and establish towns and all of that. So there's a lot more equality out west first than there are back where the original 13 colonies were. And as the new century dawned, the 50-year-old suffrage movement was adrift in what their own leaders called the doldrums. Congressional hearings had not been held since 1887. Success was nowhere in sight. You can see from this map, there's all kinds of different things that are outcomes of voting rights, and there's no universal suffrage across the country. So the women start to shift from this sort of passive campaign to something more aggressive. So during the progressive era, we see women getting involved in a lot of things, and they shift from education to agitation. So they have parades, they have protests on the Capitol steps. And in 2013, you might be familiar, the repository does a little column called Through a Century. And 100 years ago, on April 18th, 2013, so this would have been in 1913, it says, local suffragists canceled all dinner and theater parties this evening to prepare for their weekly class, learning how to handle questions and hecklers in the real campaign. So these women are hardcore training because people are going to be yelling at them, people are going to be spitting at them, they're going to be arrested, and so there's training that's happening all across the country. They also start picketing the White House. So they are picketing the president, how long must women wait for liberty? And some of their kind of strategies really centered around women's rights or women's roles as caregivers and mothers. So on the left, it says, vote yes, November 2nd, give your children equal rights. And on the right, it says, vote for our mothers. So there's an anti-suffrage movement during this time as well. And it's not just men. Women are part of it too. Some women don't think that we needed the right to vote. They're perfectly content having men handle that sort of thing. And in addition to the distillers and brewers, who of course don't want women to get the right to vote because of their preferences for prohibition and temperance, there's other groups who are also working behind the scenes against women's suffrage. So it includes Southern congressmen, corporate capitalists, so railroad magnates and meat packers. They don't want women to be allowed to vote because they're worried about their industry, which is this time is, there's child labor, there is terrible working conditions for people in factories. So there's lots of different groups that are really nervous about women voting because they're afraid. And this is one of the most popular cartoons about this. So it's election day. You see a Votes for Women sign on the wall. The mother's out to vote, and oh my goodness, dad's going to have to take care of the kids because women are going to abandon all of their domestic roles. So a lot of people are content with the status quo. They don't want to give up power. There's all kinds of reasons. But something starts to shift. In 1912, women's suffrage is supported for the first time on the national level when Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party, so he was a third-party candidate in 1912, addresses it as a major political party platform. And in 1916, Jeanette Rankin, that you see here in Montana, becomes the first woman elected to the House of Representatives. So in 1914, Montana women got the right to vote, and they vote in Jeanette Rankin to be one of their congressperson. And she, in 1918, reopens the debate on a suffrage amendment in the House, and it passes. So the amendment fails to win the 2/3 of the majority in the Senate, but it's in process now because Jeanette brings it to the forefront. And so a year later, in 1919, after years of petitioning, picketing, protesting, and parading, the 19th Amendment is finally passed by both houses of Congress, and the text is exactly the same as what was introduced in 1878. So on August 26, 1920, the 3/4 of the state legislatures that are required to ratify an amendment vote under the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, and American women win full voting rights. So that's why, even though the 19th Amendment passes in Congress in 1919, it takes all that time to pass in the different states. And that's why we are celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment in 2020, because that didn't happen until August 26th of 1920. So thank you so much. I hope that you will all vote in every election that happens in your lifetime, because women fought really hard for your right to do so. So there's no reason to stay home. Everybody should get out and vote. So thank you very much.